Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to today's Democracy Day webinar with the Objective and the Community Information Cooperative. My name is Joe Anditas. I am Assistant Director of Products and Events at the Center for Cooperative Media. The center is helping to spearhead and coordinate the Democracy Day 2023 nationwide pro-democracy reporting collaboration. I'm so excited to have you all here today. We are recording this webinar, so I'll do a couple notes up front, and then you will all get a recording or a link to the recording once the files are done processing, along with a recap email with any resources, links, or other stuff that our wonderful instructors today, our leaders, our panelists will share with you all. So off the top real quick, we are going to be doing a Q&A at the end, so please feel free to use the chat religiously throughout to leave comments, thoughts, or whatever, or questions. Once we get to the Q&A part, I'll help Gabe and Simon, who I'll introduce in a second, go through and make sure we got everybody. If you want to ask your question out loud, you can use the raised hand feature and the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom. If at any point you feel like you are about to share information that is sensitive or could put somebody in danger, if this is public, please let us know and I'll happily pause the recording. I don't think that'll be necessary for here, but in case, we want to make sure everybody's feeling safe. So with that, I will introduce and bring up on stage here our two wonderful panel leaders here. Whoops, Simon just went away from my screen. There he is. We have Simon Galperin and Gabe Schneider. Gabe is with the Objective and Simon is with the Community Information Cooperative. I will let them introduce themselves and kick it off. Gabe, Simon, take it away.
Thanks, Joe. Welcome to all for being here. Thanks for U.S. Democracy Day for hosting us. My friend and co-conspirator Gabe Schneider will be speaking momentarily. I'm going to kick us off, get us moving on the conversation and the presentation today. The plan is to do a short introduction. We'll share a little bit about the work we've done together, the Community Info Coop and the Objective, to help the Objective establish their democracy beat. And then we will go into question and answers as soon as possible, spend more time collaborating and conspiring with y'all, in addition to sharing what we know. So I'm just going to pull up my slides here. Joe, do you know if I have the ability to share screen?
You do. You are a co-host.
Fantastic. Cool. Oh. It'd be funny if I didn't know.
Yeah, just click present in the top right. Present in the top right.
Yeah, like I said, like that'd be funny. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you.
Gotcha.
That's funny. Okay, who we are, of course. Gabe Schneider is the co-executive director of The Objective, editorial director at the LA Public Press, a new nonprofit publication in LA that I'd recommend everyone follow. I'm the executive director at the Community Info Co-op. We do a number of things. One of the things we do is a local news program called The Jersey Bee, which I'm the executive editor of. We have Info Districts, which is one of our flagship programs. And of course, Just Transition, which is the work we've done with The Objective. It's a space where we do collective fundraising, training, and other organizing to help make journalism and media more equitable and just. As I mentioned, real quick, just sort of overview of what we're going to be talking about. Gabe and I will kind of use this slide to make sure we touch on these topics that y'all were expecting as you attended. And then we have a couple of assets to show you, our timeline, a pitch, and then back into questions and answers, getting to spend time with y'all, talking to you. So really briefly, I'll start with myself. My name is Simon. Like I mentioned, I'm the executive director at the Community Info Co-op. We're a journalism organization dedicated to making the field more democratic. We use policy organizing and practice to do that. We have a policy arm, which is Info Districts. We have our organizing arm, which is the Just Transition work. And then we have our local news innovation arm in the Jersey Bee. And the approach we take to journalism and democracy is that often we think about journalism as a thing that is that supports democracy, but journalists aren't actively thinking about the way they are strengthening democratic institutions to actually do the other part, to make democracy more sustainable, to make it more democratic and more equitable, more accessible, to maintain the industry, not just the industry, but the service of journalism, delivering people relevant news and information that helps them access their community, live better lives, improve their well-being, their material conditions, etc. So for us, democracy is a critical thing for journalism to function. And in the Community Info Co-op, the the way we go about that is we have, our local news arm, which does sort of like actively building out a more democratic public participatory news process. We have info districts, which is this policy position, which is the idea of creating hyperlocal taxing districts to support local news as a public utility. And then of course there's the just transition work, which is about like taking the thing we have now and making it more useful and making it more democratic. So for us, when we sat down last year to think about what, we have a very small budget, how are we going to make that work? How are we going to make that money go far and invest in this brighter future, the transition of the journalism and media ecosystem? We have this other work we've done, excuse me, about the Knight Foundation, where we're sort of like investigating and holding them accountable to their DEI and fiscal responsibility commitments. But then on the other hand, we also want to invest in the alternative, in addition to sort of investigating the thing that is and reforming it. And there's no better alternative sort of media ecosystem player, coverer, reporter, someone who can hold the space accountable more than The Objective, a nonprofit that was established a few years ago that Gabe will speak a little about that, to hold journalism accountable, I think, to the historical wrongs it's committed, and maybe set a vision for the future. So it was a great opportunity to take our dollars and think about how we invest them in this organization. So the role collaboration played in that, so that's this little second point. I'll touch on that and we'll move to Gabe. The role collaboration played is that like all things democratic, you kind of have to involve a lot of people. It has to be a collective process. You want to find consensus and work with others. So we reached out to Gabe. I reached out to Gabe and I was like, hey, I have this kind of half-baked idea. What if we created a sponsor pool and seeded that sponsor pool to create a democracy beat at The Objective? Gabe and I went back and forth a couple of times, sort of scoping that out, making sure it works. And then we went to our peers in the space. We went to US Democracy Day based at the Center for Cooperative Media. We went to IndieGraph. We went to Borealis Philanthropy and the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund. We went to our friends at the Democracy Fund, and we said, hey, we don't need a lot. We just need a little bit to get all of this money together and put it to good use, covering this space, this critical space, in a way that represents the needs of historically marginalized communities, Black and Brown communities, communities of color, working class communities, immigrant communities, et cetera. So we were excited to be able to bring that coalition together and support The Objective. And then The Objective, I think amazingly, intuitively, like smartly, turned that into an audience revenue campaign. So in addition to the dollars we were able to raise for them, they were able to make that even more through a thoughtful audience growth strategy. So I'm going to hand off over to Gabe, who might also share a little bit about the practical insights to Magic of Democracy Be and like what The Objective has learned so far. Then we'll show you some assets. We have some starter questions if we want, but we're excited to get to speak to y'all.
Sure. Thank you, Simon, for the introduction. So like Simon said, I am the editorial director at LA Public Press, which is a nonprofit news outlet focused on Los Angeles County specifically. And, I won't go too long about this, but LA County is quite vast. There's 10 million people. It's the largest county in the country in terms of population. And there's not a lot of news coverage. I'm sure you've seen the coverage lately of all the layoffs that have been happening around the county news sources. So just investing in folks that have already had news coverage, but also many folks that haven't. There's a lot of unincorporated areas of LA County that just haven't traditionally had news coverage. For today in particular, I'll be talking about, like Simon said, our work with The Objective, which has been a nonprofit newsroom examining power and inequity in journalism. So that's both how newsrooms treat their employees, right, when it comes to the intersections of their identity, but also how newsrooms have interacted with the communities that they're supposed to cover. So those two sides of the same coin. So I think what's been really lovely about this program is we've sort of iterated and figured it out as we've gone. One of the key insights for me as we were sort of trying to hire a democracy correspondent was really giving them the space to define, we had sort of put out our own definition of what we expected of the democracy correspondent and how we were defining democracy, but giving them the space to articulate to us how they think about democracy and the ways in which they wanted to sort of cover the beat. And I think giving them that space really gave us the ability to really understand where they were coming from, how they thought about democracy in terms of race, how they thought about democracy in terms of gender, in terms of power, in terms of US infrastructure. So I think that was a really important key thing that we had sort of done intentionally, but it really played out well for us in the candidate pool because we had a lot of extremely talented candidates and it was quite hard to choose. We ended up choosing 2 democracy correspondents instead of 1 because it was so difficult to choose based on the pitches that everyone had made to us. And I think everyone else was also quite qualified. We invited, I believe, everyone else to pitch us as well. So I think if we had had more money and more time, I think we would have hired more folks. And I think if we had more capacity, that would have made a lot of sense. So I think one is definitely sort of the hiring process and being intentional about the ways in which you're talking to folks about what you want, but also giving them the space to sort of pitch you on how they think the role should function. I think the other thing for us is that, and Simon had mentioned this, like we had put together democratically a small pool of sponsors. We had sort of made asks, to organizations whose budgets are in the millions or hundreds of millions. Could we have $5,000? Could we have $2,000? And all of that together really makes a difference, right? Like you can put together the inklings of a project budget quite practically with that amount of money. But I think the other constraint, which was shown to us in that we weren't able to hire more than 2 people, is that it's a small amount of money ultimately, and it's a great way to get started. But I think you're constrained in year 1 by that small budget. So I think for us, it was being creative about how we can use that money in year 1 and then think about year 2. Is this a project we want to grow after experimenting a little bit with it? So those were the 2 sort of key practical insights that I got. I think for a third quick practical insight, I think what's been extremely helpful, and I hope, perhaps you can read some of the democracy correspondents' work and perhaps they can talk about this online. But I think for us, it was really important to start them off with resources and really engage with them as to like what sort of stories we wanted to have, what sort of stories they were thinking about, just so they weren't jumping into things without any context. And the objective is really covering, it's not covering the democracy beat, it's covering how the democracy beat plays out at other newsrooms and covering how other newsrooms think about democracy. So it's sort of a meta role and a watchdog role. But I think providing them the context of where we were and then talking to them about where they were and then finding sort of shared resources and talking about resources that we've already had really put them, I think, in a great spot to cover some really interesting things. We ended up covering climate protest in front of the White House Correspondents Association. I think that was a really interesting story that I didn't see a ton of follow-up coverage on nationally. I think we're also putting together a number of interesting stories that haven't come out yet. One on the ways in which youth media are kind of infantilized and talked about and funded in a way that sort of infantilizes the labor that they're doing despite the work that they're putting in to sort of organize and change the way that young people are covered. Another great story on how strike publications have been functioning over the last few months. So looking at digital strike publications, because there's a long history of strike publications where newspaper reporters are on strike and then they open their own sort of separate publication while they're on strike. And you have that happening right now at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And you also had that happening at Business Insider. And so we're, I think, a day or so away from publishing that story. So I think what we've learned about democracy so far has been that, at least in terms of the meta coverage, there's just not a lot of it. I mean, there are some great media critics that I've obviously followed for a long time. Jay Rosen is quite prominent in the space. But I think for the most part, you don't see a lot of focus on the meta coverage of democracy coverage, and specifically when it comes to the intersections of like race, gender, class, looking at power. You just don't see a lot of that. And for us, it's been really affirming and sort of validating to have the space to be able to talk more about that and invest in that coverage. So that's been really exciting for us.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabe. Joe, stop sharing my screen. At the moment, I was going to click on the next slide. So I'm going to do that again momentarily so folks can see the other assets we were going to, the few other things we wanted to share with you all. Just open up Edge again. Here we go. We did want to let folks know just some background information about this before we get into questions, which is timeline. This happened pretty quickly. I just went into our DMs this morning and put this together. So July 10th, I reached out to Gabe, July 16th, and then by September 14th, there was already this project page. We had raised the initial pool of money, and the audience revenue campaign was also already happening, was launching. And then the other little assets to show is the pitch. This was literally the one pager we shared around with all of the participants who ended up participating, all the funders and people who supported the project ended up participating. Very brief summary, participating sponsors, total sponsor amount, and then the content format. So we did really want to keep it simple because we're raising small amounts of money and we wanted it to move as quickly as possible. I will share these slides afterwards so y'all could take a closer look at that. Finally, these are just some questions we could use to lead our conversation today. If y'all have any questions, Gabe and I are happy to answer.
I feel like a real jerk for stopping that right.
That's okay. That's all right. It happens.
I hate when people are like stuck on a slide. I want to see your beautiful face.
No, I understand. We do want to see Gabe's beautiful face. I agree.
I'm going to copy those questions. And
yes, if we could. Yeah, actually, I'll go stop sharing. I'm going to snag them from the.
The only thing I'll add really quickly is that was also the pool of initial sponsors. So like Simon mentioned, once we had sort of put out the call that we were doing this and said, hey, we're looking for some audience funding. We also had a couple other sort of institutional funders step up, specifically Mizzou and then Democracy SOS from Harkin. And I think that was really lovely to see folks say, hey, I know you're already doing this, but we're going to jump in and sort of give you some additional funding to make this work. In addition to audience revenue and folks that are objective members and donors that were sort of wanted to contribute. It was really helpful to have that baseline of funding though.
We do have a question in the chat already from Aurora who wants to add, can you talk about the use of the term sponsor versus funder or another term and how you navigate that?
So, something I learned as in this space growing up is that there's sponsor dollars and then there are grant dollars. So organizations might have money to sponsor a conference or a product or something that might be a little bit more flexible and might be used more like marketing dollars rather than a grants process that someone needs to get like formal approval for.
Okay, awesome. Folks, feel free to, you should be able to, I will allow participants to unmute. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you'd like. You can raise your hand. You can post them in the chat. Irene wants to know, did the sponsor support come with messaging for those orgs then?
Could you ask the question in a different way?
Yeah, so because it was sponsor money and was coming from their marketing department, were they expecting like a sponsor message to go with it, or was it kind of just for this project?
I don't think there were any expectations other than like we're funding the project and like we did put their logos on the sort of project page, and we did mention them in our language, but I don't think there were any explicit outlined expectations as to like we need to say X and Y and Z thing. A lot of them are sort of committed to the idea generally of like racial equity and democracy coverage. And so it was an easy sell for them.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? So why did you then choose to go after those marketing dollars instead of the grant dollars?
It's exactly what Simon said. It's faster approval. It comes from the comms budget. And it's easier to just do like a lightweight project and iterate rather than like wait months and years for like a board to approve grants.
If no one else has a question, I have one that I'd love to ask. I think I want to take a step back really quick and go back to the sort of the beginning of the project and the impetus for it. Super basic level, can you just talk about some of the things that you imagined or that you continue to imagine your democracy correspondents doing differently and how they approach this coverage? I think the word democracy is sort of blended into everything that any individual wants to think it is at this point. So can you walk us through your vision of what pro-democracy or democratic reporting looks like and what your correspondents hope to do or have done differently in their approach to that coverage? And then there's a question from Aurora after that.
Yeah, I think there was a great quote from the summit that you all just hosted about how pro-democracy coverage does not mean like pro-democrat coverage, right? It's like pro coverage of both Democrats and Republicans, like covering those folks equally when it comes to how committed are they to democratic values. But to us, it also means going outside of the sort of traditional political engagement spectrum and looking at, how does this impact, or how can we cover the ways in which journalism is intertwined with protest, with folks that are doing youth organizing, with unions. I think it's so much more expansive to us than just sort of institutional coverage or the ways in which like we might talk about like voting and Republicans, Democrats, although that is very important. And so as we think about it now, I think that's sort of trickled down into the way that democracy correspondents have started to cover things. They've covered things related to unions, which I don't think quite often gets enough coverage in the sort of meta coverage of journalism. There's not a lot of discussion of the ways in which unions are using their power to sort of democratically challenge their workplaces and fight for better conditions. So I think that's the way that we conceived of it, and I think it's played out differently based on the correspondents that we've hired. I think they've brought their own perspective to it, and I think that's really, really lovely too.
Just to underline that, like democracy is often defined as being like election day, and Democracy Day, US Democracy Day, the project has sought to sort of break that framework, but like amplifying that, plus wanting that, upvoting that. The workplaces can be democratic, consumer relationships with stores can be democratic. There are layers to democracy that are specifically sort of not really discussed. And that's where the opportunity of saying you could take a democracy, you could take like a food beat and look at it as a democracy beat. You could take a government beat and you could look at a democracy beat. There are a lot of different ways to explore the topic.
Okay, Woody Campbell has a question, but I want to get to Aurora's first. Since she asked, since the funding came from marketing budgets, do you still have to do final reports or share deliverables about the impact of the work after the project was over?
I mean, we have, but I don't think we had to. And I think we will continue to be like, hey, thank you for this funding and this is what it's achieved. But I don't think there was any explicit conversation about like end of year deliverables or anything, at least in the terms of specificity that you might get in a grant proposal.
For us, those donations came from individual donors for general operating support. So it went.
Woody, you're up.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you so much for organizing this. I really appreciate it. Yeah, just to let you know, I'm a democracy reform activist who I think wants to get into blogging about democracy reform. And yeah, and I just like my own kind of bias is that I would like to, I guess, focus a lot on I think some of the biggest impact distortions in our democracy of like gerrymandering, the malapportioned Senate, an entrenched conservative majority on the court, which it's interesting, like those aren't as newsworthy necessarily in the sense that like, they're somewhat intractable to deal with. But I don't know, just in terms of like the policy distortion, they seem to have a bigger effect than like voter ID, in my opinion, which I think is bad and racist. But I think the evidence is a bit mixed about the partisan effect. So I guess I'm curious about how you all think about the magnitude of impact of certain like the magnitude of impact of certain like distortions in our democracy and how that influences kind of like what you choose to cover.
I think it's weird to answer this question in that we cover the meta of that coverage. And so while we don't explicitly cover what you're talking about, we did do a Q&A with like Bolt's magazine, for example, who is doing, they're doing coverage of the impacts of what you're talking about on the local level and then bringing it to a national audience, which I think is a really interesting model. I mean, I could probably speak to this a little bit from my time as like assistant managing editor at VoteBeat, but I think, yeah, it's weird for us in that like we are covering other people covering it, which I think you bring up an interesting point, but yeah, it's not the explicit coverage of that thing as a correspondent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so yeah, I do understand why, yeah, you wouldn't be. I mean, for my own take, I still feel like there can be some value in thinking about that in terms of figuring out like what meta stories are good to cover. And I don't know, like one thing I do kind of think that it is valuable. What was I gonna say? Well, yeah, I mean, like one thing, I think it's messed up that we don't have like a parliamentary system, like, in, almost any states or localities for the most part. I think it's messed up that you're kind of stuck with whoever the mayor is or governor is, regardless of whether they do a good job or a bad job. And it would be great to have like more of a norm of, editorial boards, like having a standard be that like, well, okay, we will, be more likely to endorse a candidate who says, I'm willing to step down if like 2/3 of the council think I'm doing a bad job or something. So you get like something kind of similar, even if not by rules of like, a vote of no confidence or something. Again, I guess this is a little out of left field and not so much of like what's currently like in the news and what's being covered by democracy reform organizations. But I feel like there are creative ways for journalists to be radically pro-democracy in response to the biggest distortions in our democracy, one of which also includes just, again, single member districts, winner take all elections, plurality elections, which we just kind of take for granted. So
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know, like what thoughts you guys have just about that train of thought.
You're landing on I think one of the key like points of like this broader movement. I keep shouting out US Democracy Day, and it's really, I'm not a fan of these shout outs, but like the broader movement is to say that there are ways to cover this topic that are like existential crisis level coverage. And then I think what the other thing you're pointing to is the fact that a lot of news organizations aren't as committed to the idea of democracy as their marketing and PR departments might say, as their executive directors might say. So that's what I think you're running into, what you're seeing. And then what I'd say is about naming the big things, like you got to name the big things. We can't fix them until we name them, right? It's like, how can we, like, you can't, like, we'll never have democracy in a capitalist society, right? Like those two things are sort of like mutually exclusive. Capitalism requires inequality, requires racism, it requires exploitation. So the idea that you will then give people democratic rights to potentially like organize and move themselves out of that class system is a big thing that you have to name to be able to fix in 100 years, right? So I think that's what I'd say to your question.
Okay, I scrolling back up. We had a question from Aurora. Just, I think Simon, you already said you had individual donors, but were there any individual major donors, or was it just institutions?
What's major mean?
Fat stacks, I believe, is the technical term.
5K and up, like, but also like having specific one-on-one personal cultivations to support the work.
The $3,000 was seeded from like a personal donation from me as part of my commitment to giving back some of the money I received through the JSK Fellowship to other organizers and newsrooms that are doing allied work. So I would say, the only individual person involved in that process.
And then Irene makes a great point that this sounds a lot like solutions journalism lens when it comes to local democracy. And I just want to shout out Jessel Noor, who the democracy cohort manager at Solutions Journalism, who is one of the driving forces behind the organizing team for this for 2023 and got involved, I think, in 2022. It is very much so a solutions lens in a lot of this. And Jay Rosen also has a great a piece that he wrote as adapted from remarks he made at one of the first Democracy Day webinars like this last year about going even further beyond the democracy desk, although in this case it's democracy beat. But yeah, so I highly urge you to check that out. I put the link in the chat there. If there are no questions in the immediate, I do have, I of course came with a couple of them ready to go, but while we're waiting for other questions, can you talk about any of the pushback or responses, maybe not pushback, any responses you've gotten? I mean, we all love a good, like, wild YouTube comment claiming that we're, journalists are all the devil, but any institutional pushback from legacy organizations you've talked to and tried to sort of bring over to this mindset, and what that has been like, if at all? If none, I mean, you're doing a great job, but if you have received any, sort of like approaching this type of coverage tends to, get people's pearls clutched in certain circles. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fun thing is a lot of legacy organizations and their editors don't think anything that happens on Twitter is meaningful, even when the conversation on Twitter is often young people of color, trans journalists challenging their authority. So I don't think there's been a lot of response from the sort of upper echelons of power in legacy newsrooms. We did begin our sort of splash page with the sort of the two things that are happening at the Post, right, are at the Washington Post are, one, their tagline is famously "Democracy dies in darkness." It's a rebrand that they've been doing. I believe there was a Super Bowl ad. And the other is that they don't allow their reporters to advocate for their own representation in the Senate, right? DC statehood. And I think that dichotomy is really interesting. So we sort of led with that. That's not to say that's something we're going to only cover, right? That sort of institutional coverage. But I do think that in legacy organizations, when you are telling your reporters democracy is important and you don't let them engage in the democratic process, you say, oh, well, maybe you shouldn't vote, or, oh, maybe you shouldn't advocate for your ability to have representation at a very basic level in the Senate. I think that's really ridiculous. So that was sort of some of the starting point for our conversations about this work.
Bernardo Mata wants to know, it says solutions journalism is how we started on this. How do we bring processes that actually work to public policy, government, and elections arena? And I would add as well, what can editors, journalists, reporters at some of these larger news organizations with maybe not as much decision-making power, what are some suggestions that you have for them to sort of at least start to chip away at this and maybe start to guide or edge things in one direction towards more democratic and pro-democracy coverage?
I can answer the second thing, which is, I think journalists and mid-level editors can use unions and public pressure and Twitter open letters, both things that folks have done recently, strike publications to sort of apply pressure to management. You don't need to sort of work your way up to the top in order to make change. You can apply bottom-up democratic pressure to institutions, and they will ideally change or bend to your will. And if not, then you keep fighting. I mean, the New York Times has been incredibly, incredibly rude to, I wouldn't just say rude, I would say dangerous to, in their response to folks that have protested and advocated against their coverage of trans folks. And I think it's been unfortunate to see, but I've been heartened by the consistent public letters and consistent response from the team that's been putting out those public letters. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities for folks to challenge, especially collectively challenge their bosses or the folks that hired them. And the New York Times was an example of where it was a lot of contributors, right? A lot of people whose income depends on the New York Times. And I honestly would be curious to know if that's impacted their income. I mean, it's a dangerous thing to do, but I think collectively it is a lot safer.
I was at the Collaborative Journalism Summit in 2019 when I was talking to the person who ended up organizing the WHYY union drive. Like, it really is just like there are opportunities for folks who are not higher up the rung to make change and hold power accountable democratically. But then I'd also say that, like, there is the participatory, there's the structure you work within, but then there's like the structure you create around the people around you. And I think it's certainly challenging when you're like a mid-level manager in a position where you're in between the hierarchy. But you can think about the way your reporting is more participatory, your workflows and the way you talk to your team is consensus-based, the way you do conflict resolution. There are things you could do like within your own circle of influence to just make this sort of like the air you breathe slightly more equitable, in addition to then organizing with your peers and counterparts. So there is that actual more practical, like just day to day, you can kind of change up your vibe, change up your game to make it more fulfilling for you. But certainly the point Gabe made, which is like, it's about organizing. and having conversations about what democracy means.
To that point, I probably should also mention like the objective started as a collective, right? It's a collective of, and it remains to be in some ways, the leadership team is a collective of people that have jobs elsewhere in media. And we came together because we didn't feel like there was a space to sort of voice these concerns and to report on these concerns. And so I think there are a lot of ways to organize and sort of find fulfillment in challenging power structures that are outside of your job as well.
Bernardo, do you want to expand on your question or elaborate a little bit? You had a question in the chat about process, bringing those processes. You want to unmute and elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, sure. As I mentioned in the chat, this was more of a comment on the previous question, but as you answer, you gave me something to think about. It's the way we are doing this, it's a lot more slow news process, meaning looking at what people are doing on the ground and talking to them, listening to the process. There are each town, each locality. I mean, we're in Rhode Island, so it's a very small state, so we can do that. But it's looking at what they're doing on the ground and start to find out, okay, how can we show better ways to do it? Things that were working, or if they're doing really well, how can we highlight that to the other localities? To start to think, what's the best way to approach this? And not that's going to fit everybody, but how do we transform that in a way that's, I hate to use this word, but consumable, that people will not look at it and say, okay, they're just doing all this conversation. Because when we go to the community and we have this conversation, it's great. But when we publish something like that, people don't even look at it. they just get through it and say. So it's a lot more like something that we do face to face in events and talk to people. We go to the local libraries and talk to them. But as publishing, people don't pay that much attention. So how do we transform this type of coverage into something that, okay, how do we transform that into a larger conversation, even in a small state like Rhode Island, for example, or even in a metro area, for example, Boston or New York, something like that. Say, okay, let's talk about this.
I think that's a fascinating question. Simon, you could speak to this better.
I mean, so it's kind of like going back to your original question, how do we bring these processes actually work to public? Like, how do we bring them into action? Organizing, it's all organizing, which is unfortunately always the answer.
Can you explain that, define that?
Yeah, sure. So for example, the Community Info Co-op started as info districts. Very brief background, info districts. We have a vision for a special service district like your business improvement district, maybe similar to your school district, an elected board that funds local news and information projects through a dedicated tax like a public utility. And in 2020, we launched the Bloomfield Info Project, now called the Jersey Bee, to take this idea from 0 to sort of 100. And when we got started in one municipality, one city. And by organizing, what we mean is gathering with people, understanding our collective experience, learning about the functions and tools of government and community and how we can leverage our networks to build power together, create narratives together, address people's needs together. And then we take that and then that underlies our reporting. So all of our listening informs the reporting we're doing. So we want to create this generative experience for the people committed who are participating in our community. We talk to them, we create this content that's useful for them, not just like an exemplification of like, here, we had this conversation, it's lovely, but here's the thing that they can then use to take the next step, which is to hold government accountable, to hold workplaces accountable, to hold other institutions accountable. What we realized is that we can't do that in one city. The municipalities are drawn in such a way to discourage organizing, to discourage political movements and unity among Black, Latino, working class people, and like the other communities that are like also working class communities, but have been traditionally taught that white supremacy is sort of like the go-to thing. So I think that there's like these really big, you know, to say that there's these really big systemic structural challenges that would are actively preventing the solutions from taking hold, I guess is the final thing I'd say about this, and why this democracy reporting is so important. Because there are trends, again, that we talk about democratic trends, but there are also anti-democratic trends, and they are all over. So I think that identifying ways to break down those anti-democratic trends to create space for democracy, whether that's through housing, food, journalism production, media production, et cetera, is the key, Bernardo. Does that help? I hope that's in some way useful.
Woody, you're up.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I guess with a question that's more relevant to the meta coverage, I guess it's related to thinking about the impact of, especially even like left-leaning democracy coverage, because sometimes, I don't know, my own take is sometimes it seems like it just gets their readers into a doom spiral of like, okay, you know, everything's going to hell, the Supreme Court's doing this, you know, this rule's really unfair, and like, you know, and it just kind of leaves them hopeless. There's not as much like there seems to be some norm among even left-leaning journalists of like having action items at the bottom of what people can do about X. And then also, I guess, like there's I don't know, I kind of feel like they're not thinking more concretely about, okay, where can I most undo a bad policy distortion? So, I mean, I think, for example, right now, because of a party switch, I mean, you know, gerrymandering, okay, they got Republicans in North Carolina, you know, very close to a veto-proof majority, and then one party switch got them to that point. And, you know, I think one thing that would be very pro-democracy in coverage would be, you know, going over the, you know, personal lives and records of all the Republican politicians with a fine-tooth comb, and if there happens to be a scandal that forces a resignation and like undoes an unjustly, you know, gerrymandered majority's power, then I consider that to be pro-democracy coverage of sorts. And especially if you're not trying to be so objective, I feel like you should have some of that intent. And so, yeah, I'm curious about, yeah, what you've seen in your coverage about the thoughts on having action items, and also what you've seen about the thoughts of doing this, and also even like in polling certain like nonpartisan races where there could be some bad strategic voting going on, but at least like you can give people the power to strategically vote if you like commission that kind of polling to you know, empower people in that way. That's another kind of thought that can, again, undo a distortion and maybe prevent someone that nobody wants, you know, from getting elected.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you're saying if you don't want to be so objective, right? It's you know, I don't think this explicitly answers your question, because I think a lot of newsrooms are still at that point, right? The majority, I would say, of newsrooms are still saying the theory of change is like, we do a story and like we don't have an opinion about that. Like it's not for any one side or the other. It's not pro-democracy. It's not anti-democracy. We're just going to do the story, and it's going to result in some positive good. And there's a lack of development in that thinking, right? Which I think, as you know, and you just presented. And so I think the biggest problem is converting those newsrooms to a values-based approach to even get them to your line of thinking, to even get them to the place where they say, I value democracy. And so we need to do these things in order to preserve democracy in our community and expand democracy in our community. And that's a really hard sell right now for a lot of people, especially at like entrenched legacy papers where money and power are intertwined in DC and New York.
One thing briefly I'd say is that, you know, journalistic impact is sort of predicated on cycles of destruction. Like you expose wrongdoings and you win an award, you like take down corrupt official, like you described, you get some page views, but then ultimately like the actual underlying issue doesn't get fixed, and journalism can continue to maintain its sort of like, hey, we're exposing wrongs, we're exposing wrongdoing, without any genuine interest in fixing the core thing, because they actually require that core inequality to sustain their current existence, which is predominantly corporate commercial media.
Jane has a question, but can you just say that word? Journalism is predicated on cycle. What was that? Because I need to click that.
Journalism is predicated on cycles of destruction.
I love that. Leave it to Simon to drop bangers like that casually. Jane Elizabeth has a question. Jane, do you want to just ask it or do you want me to read it? Okay.
Jane just got into the car, so you should.
Oh, okay. I can read it. So she says several news orgs have launched democracy teams or hired a democracy reporter. What do you do if you find your audience isn't reading, watching, or listening to this content? I think this sort of ties into one of the previous questions as well. Like, what do we do if we're doing our usual output and it's just not hitting? What are some ways that you can find innovative ways to deliver this information outside of your traditional publication style?
I mean, the structure of traditional journalism isn't very communicative, right? Like, it isn't about being in community or organizing with your community. And so I think Simon spoke to this very well earlier. When you're just putting out traditional web or print stories and nobody's engaging with it, I think that's for a reason, right? I think you need to shake up how you're actually engaging with your audience in the community. I think you need to meet people where they are. And I think you really need to ask them, like, what don't you understand? What is it you want? Because it might not be like, how do I engage on this voting question? It might be something like, and this is true to my work at LA Public Press, it might be like, how do I deal with my landlord if he won't fix things? Like, what institutions do I need to go to and who do I need to seek out in the county, in the city, to interact with my landlord and like make sure that things are fixed and that the pipes aren't leaking? So I think it's, I think there's obvious like eat your vegetables content and like making sure that people are aware of certain things. And I think you can put out those certain things, but I think it's figuring out, where are the needs so that people can live their lives in a better and more dignified way.
I think that Michelle mentions solutions journalism in the chat, 100%, the solutions perspective of like, here's something that's actually working and that you could do yourself because someone else in a similar community did it. That's definitely an approach. And then I would say an info needs approach where you're like actually, again, understanding what people want to know about this thing and then delivering them news that they could use. We don't, for example, don't share a lot of legislative happenings in the state of New Jersey because generally people have no influence in politics. So them to be scared or worried about this other bill that's coming up just for the sake of them opening our newsletter doesn't sound like a really good relationship for us to have with people. So we specifically don't include political news, legislative news, democracy news that's not necessarily going to be useful in their day-to-day lives. That's a particular like local approach, but utility plays an important role in why people are not are not engaging in your content.
Getting some mm-hms and some yes in the chat there. Especially Michelle says folks have needs that journalism doesn't traditionally address, to Gabe's point. There was another question up top here from Sierra. I like the point Woody made about action items, and I'm wondering how you at The Objective are seeing nonprofit or hyperlocal news orgs spark civic actions in their communities through democracy reporting. Any cool stories you can share with us?
Good question.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of like what folks have been working on lately. I think a lot of our stories lately have been very much focused on like union power, looking at unions. And so I'd like to see more community stories. I think they're going to come out in the coming months. It's perhaps a good time to pitch that we're looking to expand this project and do it again next year. And so if you want to see coverage like that, happy to look into it in the coming months.
Okay, Bernardo, go ahead. You're good. You're on mute. Yeah, you're good.
It's just the sign showed up in front of me here. A couple of things here. One is almost kind of a theoretical question because we are nowhere near that point. But a lot of the work that I think people in this group here does, it's almost like we are aiming at something that's going to cost our jobs later, because we are trying to fix the problem, and then if we do it, we don't have to do this job anymore. We can do something else. But again, this is really, really far away. There's plenty of job problems to be fixed before we get to that. But I really like this connection with the needs of the community. Actually, what I see is that those needs should come first. And I think a lot of what we talk about democracy, sometimes we forget that democracy is not just the institution. Democracy is actually the people. Democracy is actually understanding what the needs of the people are and how are they coming to play in the political realm. And many times I think we don't do the best job in bringing those needs to the conversation. We may bring some needs of some people to the conversation, but we don't bring, especially the people who need us the most. How would you approach that? Because we've been trying to do that, and I know that's one of the answers. I think Simon's already going to say it is organize. You have to find ways to get that organized in some way. But mainly, I think one of the problems that we do have is that journalism or organizations are designed to think about audiences, designed to think about the people who pay us for the news or support us for the news that we provide. And the people that I try to work with are the people who will never, ever be able to afford the news. So how do we bring the needs of those people to the center? That's kind of my question.
You want to take it, Gabe? Should I give it a swing?
Yeah, why don't you give us one?
I have that. I mean, we have that same challenge, right? As a local news organization, primarily serving a community that's majority people of color, majority, like a significant plurality, low-income working class folks. And it's never like I'm never gonna win. I'm never gonna win. There's no win. There's never gonna be the right amount of people in the room, the right people in the room. It's like you said, like you call democracy, the people. I think of it as a process. I'm never gonna get away from it. I'm always gonna want more people in the room, different people in the room, so that I can understand the general needs of people and then begin to deliver them things that are useful to them. So I think that really redefining what we think of news and information, what we think of service, Bernardo, like if you are talking to those people, but they're not reading your news, you're still reaching those people, right? If you're just because they're not reading your newsletter, but you're talking to them day to day or like week to week, month to month, that's a service, that is an engagement. But then I would say that this is where we're gonna veer off on Community Info Coop land, where the issue is public funding. We need public funding of public services in the United States, broadly defined public services, including local news and information, so people can have access to democracy, civic participation, and action. So I think that's really the way we get this industry there. We get the people in this industry there. The jobs will never go away. There's plenty of work to be done. There's just no one who seems to be willing to pay for it. So we need to redistribute the cost and the workload amongst people so that we can all enroll ourselves in this process of democratizing more of the US. An active democratization role is critical for the media to take at this time.
Gabe, do you want to finish this out and add to that, or should we wrap?
I think let's wrap. I think Simon's the one you need to talk to on this.
I would agree. As his neighbor and friend, I do that a lot. I call him up. Bernardo, I will just note that Bernardo set up in the chat that he is going to be trying to implement an info districts model iteration in Rhode Island. So stay tuned. He will be in contact. Just want to thank both of you. I was not gonna lie, I was a little nervous when the slides ended at like 18 minutes in, and I was like, I have 4 questions prepped. So hopefully we get some engagement. Thank you all to you in the chat and the other attendees. This is fantastic. Everything from the quotes, the quotables to the actual substance was really powerful. And I really appreciate it. And I look forward to our next Democracy Day webinar. That's going to be on July 10th. That is with Trusting News. It's about demystifying your politics and government coverage, particularly your democracy coverage. I will drop a link to that in the chat. Please register for that. For those of you who registered for today's webinar, again, I will just remind you, you will be getting a recording of that, as well as any links and resources that were shared in the chat, and there were many. So I really do appreciate everybody. Thank you so much for showing up. and coming out for this. Thank you, Gabe and Simon. This is just absolutely fantastic. So thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. If you need to get in contact with any of us, I will include Gabe and Simon's email information, contact information in the recap. And if you want to reach out to the center or to Democracy Day, you can email info@usdemocracyday.org, or you could go to usdemocracyday.org and join as a reporting partner. This is one of the largest collaborative reporting projects ever undertaken in the United States. We need you. We need your journalism. We need your newsrooms, and we need your energy. So do a spirit bomb and give us your energy here, please. So thank you, everybody, again, and we'll see you soon. Have a great weekend, folks.